What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be conscious? Is it a good thing? Is it escapable? No. And there's nothing any of us can do about it. These are the principal questions and answers put forth by author Thomas Ligotti in his book, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race. In this video, we will examine the ideas put forth by Thomas Ligotti, and at the very end, we will confront the question of whether or not to accept Ligotti's ideas on the horrors of being. The reason you likely haven't heard this author before is because prior to 2015, he was still relatively obscure. He began his career writing short stories for small press magazines, and finally published a collection of them in 1986 called Songs of the Dead Dreamer. Over the next 30 years, he continued to be prolific, writing many short stories and publishing different collections, and garnering a few Bram Stoker awards. Between all of his different works, he garnered a devout, small yet powerful, avid fan base, who continued to read anything that Ligotti would write. But still, Ligotti remained in relative obscurity, and it was actually his peers and contemporaries that coined him the name the best-kept secret in horror. It wasn't until 2015, when Penguin Classics published a single volume of his first two short story collections, that he was elevated to the status of serious literature and serious author. Now, I'm sure many of his fans would scoff at that idea, but that's precisely how I was introduced to Ligotti. Because it was Penguin Classics, in addition to publishing his short story collections, also republished this book. Ligotti's oeuvre falls under the genre of cosmic horror, a genre popularized by the late H.P. Lovecraft, a stated influence on Ligotti's work. Cosmic horror isn't concerned with the anthropomorphic scares commonly found in most horror stories, like the devil, vampires, mummies. Instead, cosmic horror distances itself from humanity. It examines the powers of indifferent beings who are on cosmic scales and proportions. Cthulhu's evil is not a Christian one, where a devil singles people out, or that of a god that tallies up people's wrongdoings to punish them later. No, Cthulhu is frightening specifically because of its indifferent malevolence. It simply fails to register anything of value or of importance within our humanity and our species. It's the indifference of billions of icy planets, the eternal vacuum of space. It simply doesn't care. Scholars nowadays interpret Lovecraft's work as a sort of dark metaphor for the cold truth about our universe. When you look at Earth and humanity from Cthulhu's perspective, you embark on a task known as unhumanization, where you're able to see things more clearly from an objective point of view rather than your own human subjectivity. This is precisely where Ligotti comes in. He argues that our pursuit of knowledge beyond the human grasp is really just a mask, hiding our deeper urge to escape into it. Our human perceptions fuse the appearance of something with its function, and then we create meaning. Professor Michael W. Clune puts it nicely, saying, "The appearance of the street lamp is welded to the function of lighting streets, which is welded to the effort to prevent crime, which is welded to the concerns of the middle-class suburbanites, and so on. This is human reality." But if we sever this link between appearance and function and meaning, we open ourselves up to a world full of possibility. What if this streetlight is submerged in water? What if this streetlight is a fantastic antenna operated by a secret organization? What if this streetlight is a thin metallic alien holding its breath until I look away? Cosmic horror thrives on this disjunction. Lovecraft's tales unravel the familiar world. Ligotti, on the other hand, dwells on how mere shifts in appearances can create a world completely alien to us. He explores the psychological unraveling that occurs when we lose grip on meaning. Except as a form of popular entertainment, I don't think that horror fiction ever had a future. In my view, it has only been a pure accident that joined the tastes and temperaments of someone like Poe or Lovecraft to a talent sufficient to express these tastes and his temperament, which, as Lovecraft pointed out many times, are the province of few individuals. Let's say it once and for all. Poe and Lovecraft, not to mention a Bruno Schultz or Frank Kafka, were what the world at large would consider extremely disturbed individuals. And most people who are that disturbed are not able to create works of fiction. These and other names I can mention are people who are just on the cusp of total psychological derangement. That's where the future development of horror fiction lies. And the next person who is almost too emotionally and psychologically damaged to live in the world, but not too damaged to produce fiction. Thomas Ligotti. From the introduction of his book, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, Ligotti presents the reader with an idea that flows from the start to the very finish line of the book. What do we see in the reflection? Only what we want to see, what we can stand to see. Through the prophylactic of self-deception, we keep hidden what we do not want to let into our heads, as if we will betray ourselves, a secret too terrible to know. We believe we are making a go of it on our own, and anyone who contradicts this belief will be taken for a madman, or someone who is attempting to immerse others in a convenience of horror. How to take seriously a puppet master who has gone over to the other side. Ligotti's ideas on life echo that of his on cosmic horror, that we are all strapped into the carriage of consciousness, unable to get out and unable to direct the ride. We might think that we are in control, but really, we're not. We are just experiencing this collective illusion. To Ligotti, this is the true essence of horror. Internally, consciousness is inescapable. Try as you might, but you cannot separate yourself from it. Even worse, it also happens to be responsible for all of life's discontents, its pains, and its sufferings. It is strangely also aware of its own shortcomings and of its own speed race towards death. As humans, we are all unfortunately aware that death awaits us all at the end. And we are also equally aware that life's joys and pleasures are transient and wither away at a rate equal to that at which we hurtle closer and closer towards the end. With that, Ligotti presents us with two distinct points of view, that of the optimist and the pessimist. The optimist, Nicholas Humphrey, refers to life as something that is good in and of itself. On the other hand, the much more discussed Norwegian philosopher, Peter Zapffe, specifically his work, The Last Messiah, refers to consciousness as a breach in the very unity of life, an abomination, an absurdity, an exaggeration of disastrous nature. Drawing from Zapffe, he argues that human life is structured around two horrible constants: pain and the fear of death. These truths are too overwhelming for most people to confront head-on, so they create systems to distract themselves from it. They distract themselves through entertainment, hedonism, or the illusion of religion or the afterlife. But Ligotti knows that these just mask the true undeniable reality, that human life moves only in one direction, towards disease, decay, and death. This is what he calls the biological paradox. We are burdened with a consciousness that we can't live with, yet we cannot live without it. Our tragedy is the desperate search for meaning beyond the mechanical, visceral cycle of life, reproduction, and decay. And it is a tragedy because we feel that there is a greater meaning to life. We deceive ourselves into ignoring our true state of affairs, whether it be through substance abuse, which literally alters our state of consciousness, ideology and religion, or, most famous of them all, the simple belief that the good does outweigh the bad, that all of life's joys and all of life's pleasures, in the end, are worthwhile, that it would have been better to experience this pain and suffering rather than to never experience anything at all. Ligotti sees this as an illusion, leaving us in a liminal space between existence and non-existence. You can think of this as a sort of living puppet, where humanity is nothing more than a group of believers in a bloated sense of self-importance. And so, we have the optimists, those who believe that life's positives do outweigh its horrors, and the pessimists, those who have accepted an even darker truth, that life, at the end, is simply malignantly useless. What I find interesting is that this pessimism does follow a solid logic. You cannot deny the fact that life is followed by a string of suffering, hunger, illness, loss. It's hard to defend yourself against that argument. You find that Ligotti's stance isn't vindictive. It's actually deeply intellectual. When you think about it, nothingness would have been preferential, because it would have meant no suffering, no pain, no fear of death. In other words, it would have been better to have never been. Yet, we all have been, and we are all here. And so the question remains, what do we do with this knowledge? Though seemingly the only true escape from this issue is by and large out of the question. To a pessimist, its pain and futility render itself no more appealing than the suffering that it is trying to escape from. So now we're able to understand Ligotti's point of view from an intellectual perspective. But what's interesting is that his viewpoint, his ideas, and his ideology are present in nearly every single one of his short stories. One famous example is from his second short story collection, Grimscribe, titled The Shadow at the Bottom of the World. In an unnamed farming community, an unnatural season descends, a new autumn, marked by oppressive warmth and thick, sunless clouds. The heat radiates from a lone field where a scarecrow flails unnaturally, as if hanged by invisible hands. The ground beneath it is dark and spongy, exuding an eerie warmth. When the townspeople tear the scarecrow apart, they discover beneath its straw a human-shaped mass of fungus-like darkness. Their attempts to destroy it fail, and by morning, the scarecrow is vanished, replaced by a bottomless pit. As the townspeople board over the abyss, the town itself turns nightmarish. Malevolent faces appear, and all suffer from horrific dreams. Only an old man, Mr. Marble, seems to grasp the unfolding horror. When an unnatural storm of light engulfs the town, Marble is possessed by an unnamed force, stalking the streets with a knife in search of a sacrifice. Struggling against his possession, he ultimately flees town and is found at dawn, dead by his own hand beside the pit. The townspeople, having hidden in terror while Marble fought his battle alone, show no gratitude for his sacrifice. Without ceremony, they discard into the abyss. Something worth thinking about after reading or hearing a summary of that story. What is the abyss? What is this unnatural warmth? What are the townspeople doing by showing no thanks and by dumping the body into the very hole that caused all of this mess? You might have come across this term before, antinatalism. It's actually the option that Ligotti suggests we do with the problem of the horror of consciousness. The practice of antinatalism is to deliberately stop the reproduction of the human race in order to inevitably lead to its extinction. To quote from the man, Ligotti himself, from a 2011 interview, antinatalism is based on the principle that suffering of whatever kind or degree should not be caused or perpetuated, and that human existence necessarily entails suffering that we can neither escape nor justify, least of all by experiencing pleasures. Thus, the only way to end all suffering is to cease producing beings who suffer. In the abstract, I hold to that principle, and believe that those who do not hold it are simply of a different mindset. In everyday life, I live for the most part as a deluded individual, except for when I sit down and recall what I believe in principle. Like many of us, we have strong philosophies, yet we don't find ourselves putting them into practice. We live in our own deluded sense of escapism, and we are confronted with our own horrors until we sit down, alone, and start to think. It's important to know that Ligotti doesn't come at this from a dogmatic or evangelical point of view. He isn't trying to convince you or convert you one way or the other. And he isn't sadistically scheming to end the world and all of humanity like a cartoonish evil villain. From Ligotti's point of view, antinatalism is the safest and most pleasant option for humanity. In practice, it's nothing more than a thought experiment, something that reaffirms Ligotti's point of view on his opinions of existence and consciousness, He knows that the average person isn't going to hear what he has to say and be convinced themselves to never procreate. He concedes that most people are optimists, and there's nothing really that you can do to get in the way of that opinion. For example, I'm someone who's most likely sympathetic towards this guy. I've made a 20-minute video explaining his whole ideology, and yet, at the end of the day, I'm still an optimist. Antinatalism would go against millions of years of human evolution that has kept us alive up to this point. There's no way it's going to become the dominant ideology. But, for the time being, it's an interesting thought experiment. While no one can prove that there is any praiseworthy incentive to reproduce, there are cases in which most would agree that there are indeed praiseworthy, or at least not blameworthy incentives not to reproduce. The latter, naturally, includes the creation of a complete individual, an individual who will suffer, who will fear death, and one day will die. Like I promised, I am here to confront the answer on whether or not you should agree with Ligotti on his proposed idea to end the supposed horror of existence. And my response is, it likely does not matter. If you were to learn one thing from Ligotti's nonfiction work, it would be that suffering, consciousness, the world reflected onto our own ego, and our ego projected onto the world, it's all inescapable. If you're watching this video, if you're watching this right now, it's because at some point in time, your parents had sex and birth into existence someone that will think, feel, experience pain, and one day die. What does believing anything, for that matter, one way or another, have any real effect on those simple truths? From my humble opinion, I think it's important to have goals, to have interests, to have friends and loved ones. Because there is one thing that Ligotti cannot deny. It's that positive experience does exist. Even if it is a finite resource that wavers quickly only to return us to the natural state of nothing or suffering or pain or whatever you want to call it, it's still there. Finding those moments, for whatever it's worth, to me, are worth it. That's a wrap on Thomas Ligotti. There was so much I wanted to include in this video, but I simply didn't have the time. I'm trying to make these weekly videos, so I do a lot of reading for them and a lot of writing, and I inevitably have to record these and edit them all within a week. So 20-25 minutes is probably the maximum length of something that I'm able to produce, but who knows? Maybe one day I'll take more time and make these a little bit longer and put a little bit more effort into them. Not that I'm not putting in effort right now. Anyway, I started reading this book 2 years ago, I believe, and I stopped around halfway through because, honestly, it was making me too sad. Because, like I mentioned in this video, it's almost impossible to find any concrete flaws in Ligotti's argument. At the end of the day, there are two options, optimism and pessimism, and he is a really smart pessimist. So you can't really deny that. But the way I think about it is if there are two options, and one of the options makes me feel all right most of the time, and the other option makes me feel not so great most of the time, I don't care if the not so great one ends up being more true, because it won't matter. We're all on the same ride, nevertheless. So I'm going to be an optimist. I do really recommend you check out this book if you have the stomach for it. It's really good. I also recommend reading all of the short stories, because that's a more palatable way to digest this horrible, not horrible, but you know what I mean, sad way of thinking. Not sad even. I don't know. Anyway, here are this video's stats. Subscribe, 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 subscribe.